The desert stretched endlessly, its horizon a wavering blur under the relentless glare of the sun. The heat pressed down like an invisible hand, suffocating and merciless. She stumbled across the sand, her lips cracked, her throat dry as bone. The betrayal that brought her here replayed in her mind with every faltering step, sharper than the sting of the hot wind against her skin. They had left her, those she had trusted, those who smiled with false warmth while hiding envy and fear behind their eyes. In the darkness of their hearts, they had convinced themselves that her presence threatened them, that her strength and light made their shadows too visible. And so, in whispers and schemes, they decided that she must be erased, carried far away into the merciless desert and abandoned where no one could hear her cries. She remembered their faces when they left her there, pretending pity but unable to hide the satisfaction curling at the edges of their mouths. The cart's wheels had turned away without hesitation, their footsteps fading until only the sighing of the desert wind kept her company. Alone. That word struck her harder than the heat, harder than the cruel sun that burned her skin raw. Alone, as though she had never mattered, as though her story could be cut short like an unfinished tale. The betrayal pierced deeper than the desert's thorns, heavier than the sand she dragged her feet through. Each grain seemed to mock her, whispering of her helplessness, of her abandonment, of how quickly trust could dissolve into nothing. Hours blurred into one another as she searched for water, for shade, for anything that resembled life. Her sandals tore, her feet blistered, and each step sank her deeper into despair. The sun blazed higher, an unrelenting overseer, as if it too wished to see her perish. She lifted her eyes to the empty sky, the blue so wide it seemed to swallow her, and felt smaller than ever before. The desert was vast, but what crushed her spirit more was the knowledge that human hearts could be even vaster in cruelty. The people who had once sat with her, eaten with her, laughed with her, had cast her away like dust. Memories of the betrayal clung like shadows she could not shake. She had been warned before, quietly and subtly, that some envied her, that whispers carried her name in tones of resentment. But she had not believed it. She had chosen to see the best in them, to offer kindness in return for suspicion. It was kindness that led her to blindness, and blindness that delivered her to this wasteland. Even as she trudged forward, her body begging her to collapse, she wondered how envy could turn so violent, how fear could birth such cruelty. The desert outside was merciless, but the desert inside, the barren hollows of her heart where trust had died, felt even harsher. Her breaths grew ragged, her chest tightening with every inhale. The air shimmered ahead, creating illusions of water, of lush trees, of life within reach. She stumbled toward them, desperate, only to find the sand grinning at her once more. Mirage after mirage broke her spirit, reminding her that hope itself could be a cruelty when misplaced. She sank to her knees at last, her body too weary to resist. The betrayal replayed one last time in her thoughts, their eyes avoiding hers as they turned their backs, the silence louder than any farewell. It was not the desert that abandoned her first, it was them. Yet even as she lay there, defeated by exhaustion, something inside her refused to surrender completely. Betrayal had shattered her, but the fire within her, faint and flickering, had not yet died. She thought of how the desert consumed all who underestimated it, and how perhaps her enemies had underestimated her too. The same strength they feared, the resilience they envied, still lingered in her veins. If the desert was to take her, it would not be quietly, it would not be easily. She pressed her palm into the burning sand, feeling its sting, reminding herself that pain meant she was still alive. And as long as she lived, she would not let their betrayal be the end of her story. The horizon swam before her eyes, blurred by heat and tears, but she clung to it. Somewhere beyond this barren expanse, the world still moved, the stars still watched, and the wind still carried voices. She whispered her own name into the emptiness as if to remind the desert, and herself, that she existed, that she would not vanish into silence no matter how hard they wished it. The desert may have been chosen as her grave, but her spirit refused to lay down in it. The sun dipped slightly, shadows stretching long across the sand. She gathered what little strength remained and forced herself up again. Every step felt like a rebellion, every breath like defiance. They wanted her erased, but each moment she survived became proof that she was not so easily undone. The betrayal was a wound that would never leave her, but it also became the fuel that kept her moving. In the face of cruelty she chose endurance. In the heart of the desert, where life seemed impossible, she vowed silently that she would endure until the desert itself grew weary of fighting her. The sun rose higher, blazing with a merciless fire that scorched every grain of sand around her. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of heat shimmering beneath the horizon. Her body trembled as she walked barefoot, each step sinking into the blistering ground that seared her skin. The air itself felt like fire, heavy and suffocating, stealing the breath from her lungs. With each gust of wind, grains of hot sand clung to her face, scratching and cutting her skin as though the desert itself sought to break her down. Her lips cracked, bleeding from dryness, and her tongue felt like stone inside her mouth. Yet, though her body faltered, her heart held on with a strength that refused to surrender. Hours passed, though in her torment it felt like years. The heat gnawed at her skin, turning it red and raw. Hunger clawed at her stomach, twisting her insides with an unbearable ache. She had eaten nothing since the moment she was cast away, and every step forward burned more energy than she had left to give. But she kept moving, as if each painful step was an act of defiance against those who had abandoned her, against the desert that sought to devour her whole. At times she collapsed, her body sprawled against the burning ground, eyes dim with exhaustion. Yet something inside, a whisper, a pulse, a fragment of her will, always forced her to rise again. She would not die here, nameless and forgotten. The nights brought no comfort. When the sun sank, the world turned cruel in another way. The heat gave way to an icy chill that seeped into her bones. The sand, which had burned her feet by day, now froze her as she lay curled upon it, trembling with cold. Above her, the sky glittered with 1,000 stars, distant and indifferent. She reached out to them, her hand trembling as if to ask for mercy. None came. Her throat ached for water, but no oasis appeared. Only silence and the endless shifting winds answered her pleas. Yet even then, she held her breath steady, forcing herself to remember that despair would only feed her suffering. She would not let her spirit break. Sometimes she thought she saw mirages, shadows of trees swaying in the distance, pools of glistening water that promised relief. She ran toward them with the last of her strength, only to find nothing but more sand, more emptiness, more despair. Each time she fell to her knees, weeping silently, her tears dried before they could even reach her cheeks. The desert mocked her, luring her with false promises, and still she pressed forward. Pain screamed in her body, but her heart whispered courage. Voices haunted her in the wind. At first she thought they were tricks of her mind, illusions born of hunger and thirst. But they grew louder, like the voices of those who had betrayed her, calling her weak, unwanted, cursed. Rage flared in her chest at the sound, and she screamed back at the wind, her voice hoarse and broken but filled with fury. She would not give them the satisfaction of her surrender. If she was to die, it would not be as a broken soul begging for mercy. It would be as one who fought until her final breath. As days passed, her body wasted away. Her legs grew thin, her skin cracked, her eyes hollow. Yet her spirit remained fierce. She remembered the faces of those who had cast her out, their cruel smiles as they left her to fate. She remembered the life that had been stolen from her, the dreams she had held, the kindness she had given. And she swore to herself that the desert would not take those memories from her. Even if she perished here, she would carry her truth to the end. One evening, as the sun dipped once more, she lay sprawled upon the dunes, her strength nearly gone. The sky burned with hues of red and gold, as if the heavens themselves were aflame. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling with effort. For a moment, her heart wavered, whispering that it would be easier to let go, to surrender to the silence. But then the wind brushed against her cheek, cool and gentle, almost tender, as though the desert itself had changed its tone. It carried a faint hum, a melody she did not understand yet felt deeply. The sound stirred something within her, something stronger than pain or fear. She closed her eyes and whispered back to the wind, vowing that she would hold on, that she would endure this ordeal until the stars themselves remembered her name. Her suffering was not just of the flesh but of the spirit. Hunger and thirst tore at her body, but loneliness gnawed at her soul. She was surrounded by silence so vast it could swallow her whole. Yet, in that silence, she began to hear herself more clearly than she ever had before. Her heartbeat, faint yet steady, reminded her she was still alive. Her breath, ragged but unbroken, proved she still belonged to the living. The desert tested her, but it could not erase her will. Her suffering became her trial, and her defiance, her shield. And so, though her body staggered closer to collapse, her heart carried her onward. She would not surrender to the desert. She would not surrender to betrayal. She would not surrender to despair. Her ordeal burned her, scarred her, tore her apart. But in the ruins of her suffering she found the seed of something unbreakable. The desert could strip her of everything, but it could not strip her of herself. The first night after days of torment came with no promise of relief. The desert sky stretched endlessly above her, a dome of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, yet each one only reminded her of her smallness. She lay on the sand, her body blistered from the sun's cruel hands, her lips cracked like broken earth. Each breath she drew was sharp, scraping against her throat as if she inhaled knives. Sleep, when it came, was more like a fainting spell, a collapse into exhaustion rather than rest. Yet in that fragile state between waking and dreaming, something shifted in the silence of the desert. The wind, which had so far been only a carrier of heat by day and of bitter chill by night, brushed against her face differently. It did not bite, it did not whip, it caressed. And as it moved through the dunes, she thought she heard something impossible. Her name. At first, she dismissed it as the hallucination of a dying woman. The desert often tricked wanderers with mirages, and what could be crueler than a mirage of a voice? Yet this was not a voice that demanded or mocked. It was gentle, as though the desert itself was cradling her in a lullaby. Amina, it sighed, the syllables drawn out like a secret shared only with her. Her breath caught, her parched throat tightening as tears threatened. She had not heard her name spoken with kindness in so long. The last words she remembered from her betrayers had been sharp with contempt and fear. But here, in this expanse of loneliness, the wind itself seemed to remember who she was. She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff with pain, and listened. The desert was alive with subtle sounds, the shifting of sand, the low rustle of unseen movements in the dark, but amidst it all, there it was again, faint, almost lost to the night. Her name. Not shouted, not spoken aloud, but carried, like a memory being breathed back into her bones. She clutched at the sound as if it were water. Her cracked hands trembled, and she pressed her palms into the sand, grounding herself against despair. She whispered back, though her voice was almost gone, "I am still here." The words barely escaped her lips, but the wind seemed to hear, for it stirred again, circling her body gently, brushing against her skin like an unseen hand reassuring her that she was not alone. The night deepened, and as the stars wheeled overhead, she felt something within her change. The desert was no longer just an enemy of heat and thirst. It had become something more, a witness, a listener. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell by the fire, tales of how the spirits of ancestors traveled with the wind, watching, guiding, whispering to those who were lost. She had dismissed those tales as children's comfort, but now, alone in this cruel wasteland, she wondered if those voices lived in the wind. Perhaps it was not the desert that whispered, but those who had loved her and refused to let her name be forgotten. Her suffering did not vanish. The thirst still raged within her, gnawing at her throat. Her stomach still ached from hunger, and her skin still burned from the cruel day. But in that whisper she found something her enemies had hoped to strip from her: hope. For the first time since she had been left behind, her mind drifted from death toward survival. If the wind knew her name, if the stars could hear it carried across the dunes, then perhaps she was not as lost as she believed. Perhaps the desert, in all its merciless expanse, was not only her grave but also her stage for rebirth. Her eyes, though heavy, lifted to the stars. They glittered coldly like shards of glass scattered across the sky, yet each seemed brighter now. She imagined the wind carrying her name upward, weaving it into the constellations, etching it across the heavens so that she could not be erased. She saw herself reflected in the stories of old, heroes and heroines who endured the wilderness, who were broken by trials yet remembered in the voices of the land. Could she, abandoned and discarded, also become such a story? She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the weak but steady beat of her heart. It had not given up yet. Neither would she. When she drifted into sleep, she dreamed, not of water or food, but of a great expanse of sky where the stars leaned close to whisper her name with the wind. They told her she was not forgotten, that her life was not meant to end here, shriveled and alone. They reminded her that her name was hers, her identity unbroken, her spirit unyielding. And when she awoke in the chill of dawn, though her body still ached, though her lips were still cracked and bleeding, her spirit had been given a new shield. She rose slowly, her body trembling, but her gaze was steady. She was no longer just a victim abandoned to die. She was Amina, and the desert itself had remembered her. As the morning sun began to burn the horizon, she whispered to the wind once more, her voice hoarse but resolute, "Carry me forward." And though no sound answered, the breeze lifted, brushing her face as if promising it would. The desert was never silent, though to an untrained ear it seemed so. At night, the wind hummed through unseen valleys of sand, the grains shifted and hissed against one another, and the vastness breathed like a living creature. She lay curled on the ground, her skin burned raw by day and chilled by night. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat a rebellion against the cruelty that had abandoned her there. And yet, as the moon lifted its pale face above the dunes, something shifted. Her eyes, dry, stung with exhaustion, lifted to the heavens. For nights she had glanced upward, too weary to truly see, but this night was different. The stars did not simply scatter across the sky as they always had, they seemed to pulse. They shimmered brighter, as though awakened. Constellations she once heard of as a child, tales told by elders around fire, suddenly revealed themselves not as distant specks, but as living patterns. She blinked, rubbed her sore eyes, and still the stars appeared closer, sharper, radiant with intent. One in particular, a star just above the horizon, flickered with unusual persistence. It did not remain still like the others, it seemed to call. Her parched lips parted as though she could whisper back, but no sound came. Instead, she dragged her frail body upright, swaying under the vast dome of night. For the first time since her abandonment, the weight of despair lifted slightly. She felt watched, remembered, and perhaps, guided. Each night thereafter, the stars became her map. She noticed how certain ones aligned above distant dunes, how they shifted as though nudging her forward. She stumbled by day, resting when the sun punished her skin, but at dusk she rose and followed the quiet language of light. And always, the flickering star ahead glowed brightest, waiting for her. As she walked, memories returned, memories she had buried when bitterness and pain consumed her. She remembered her grandmother's voice, telling of ancestors who lived by the stars, who crossed vast deserts by trusting their whispers in the sky. "The stars are our memory," her grandmother had said. "When you are lost, they will not forget you." At the time, those words felt like nothing more than stories. Now, alone in the wilderness, they became her only truth. On the fourth night of following them, she collapsed from exhaustion near a hollow in the dunes. The air was cold, the sand biting against her wounds, but above her the stars formed what looked like an open hand, its fingers stretched in blessing. Tears stung her eyes, not just from suffering but from a strange awe. She felt she had not been forsaken after all. Even if every person she once knew had turned their back, the heavens themselves remembered her name. The wind, too, played its part. It no longer stung her with cruelty. It brushed her shoulders gently, nudging her when she slowed, cooling her when thirst threatened to break her resolve. Sometimes it seemed to murmur, echoing the same whispers she had first heard. In those whispers she imagined words, keep walking. Do not surrender. Whether they were her own desperate inventions or gifts from unseen forces, she could not tell. But they filled her with a strength greater than water or food. Nights became holy to her. Each evening she awaited the moment when the first star lit the sky, and with trembling determination she would rise again. Pain was her constant companion, her stomach hollow, her lips cracked, her body bruised from falls. But above her, the stars were constant too, eternal guardians against despair. Sometimes she wondered if the stars belonged to the souls of the forgotten. Perhaps those who had perished in deserts long before her had been carried upward, their spirits burning eternal to guide others. So, then she was not walking alone. The dead themselves bore witness to her struggle, reminding her that endurance could become legend. On one night, as she rested her head upon her arm, she dreamed, or thought she dreamed, that the stars moved closer. They curved into the shape of a great river, shimmering like water. She reached out with trembling hands, wishing to drink, but the vision dissolved into the true desert sky. Still, she awoke with renewed hope, convinced that the stars had shown her what was possible, that water, life, and survival lay ahead if she trusted them. Days turned to nights, nights to days. The desert remained merciless, but she no longer saw herself as prey to its cruelty. With every step guided by starlight, she was not simply surviving, she was being transformed. Fear gave way to faith, despair to resolve. And always the thought lingered, perhaps she had been abandoned so that she could discover this truth, that the world of men may betray, but the world of the cosmos never forgets. The same stars that guided her ancestors now stretched their ancient hands toward her. As dawn broke one morning, she stood atop a dune and looked behind her. The endless desert stretched in all directions, but above, the stars still faded slowly, reluctant to vanish. She whispered with her last breath of the night, "I see you. I will follow." And for the first time since she was left to die, her heart felt steady, even proud. For though her body was weak, the stars had taught her this: she was not lost. She was being led. The desert had already claimed many before her. Travelers lost, warriors broken, and children forgotten by tribes who could not carry more mouths into the barren expanse. Yet as she staggered forward, her body trembling with exhaustion, she began to notice that her own loneliness was not complete. Something else stirred among the dunes. At first, it was only the play of the wind, soft sighs curling through the sand ridges as the night deepened. She thought it a trick of her mind, born of hunger and thirst. But then, as she paused beneath the weight of the stars, she heard the sound more clearly. It was not merely the wind. It was voices, ancient, mournful, yet kind. The desert, she realized, was not empty. Her grandmother had once told her stories of spirits that roamed the wastes, guardians of forgotten paths, echoes of those who had perished but refused to leave. They were said to ride the shifting winds, to carry messages across dunes, and to protect the ones who had not yet fulfilled their destinies. Most who spoke of them did so with reverence, for to anger a desert spirit was to invite misfortune. But to be cradled by their whispers was to be chosen. And now they seemed to choose her. The air pressed gently around her shoulders, like unseen hands guiding her steps. When her legs trembled, a breeze lifted the weight for a heartbeat, as though giving her enough strength to take another stride. When despair clawed at her chest, a sudden rush of cool wind wrapped around her, soothing her like a mother's embrace. She whispered into the night, her voice hoarse but steady. "Who are you? Why do you follow me?" The wind answered not in words but in sensations, a rise of air that brushed her cheek, a hollow cry that rolled over the dunes like distant drums. She understood without language, "You are not alone." By the second night she began to see them, not with her eyes, but with the space behind them, the way one glimpses figures in dreams. Wisps of pale light moved within the dunes, taking shapes that flickered like smoke. A child with sand for hair, a warrior whose body gleamed like polished stone, an old woman whose shawl was woven of the night sky. They walked beside her, behind her, always just beyond the reach of her hands. Some were silent, watching. Others whispered in the hush of the wind. Their words were half-formed, but she could sense their meaning. "Do not give in. Your journey is not finished. The desert does not claim you, it tests you." She wept when she heard this, not because she was afraid, but because she felt, for the first time since her abandonment, that the universe had not forgotten her name. The days remained brutal, the sun a burning eye, the ground a furnace beneath her feet. Her lips cracked and her stomach writhed with emptiness. Yet the spirits never left her. When her thirst became unbearable, a sudden gust revealed a hollow in the sand where morning dew had gathered in a tiny pool. When she nearly collapsed from hunger, the wind shifted the dunes, uncovering the buried remains of desert roots, brittle but edible enough to quiet her pain. More than once she thought, "This is impossible. No one survives this alone." But she was no longer alone. By the third night she felt strong enough to walk steadily beneath the stars. The spirits now gathered closer, and she could feel their presence as surely as her own heartbeat. They moved like shadows stitched into the sky, yet their touch carried warmth, not dread. One spirit, tall and cloaked in shimmering heat, walked beside her the longest. Though its face was hidden, she sensed a deep sorrow within it, as though it too had once been left to die on these sands. And yet it had chosen to remain, not as a victim but as a guardian. "Why me?" she asked, her voice carried by the wind. "Why not others who perished here?" The spirit's cloak rippled as though stirred by an unseen flame, and she heard the faintest reply, threaded between the gusts. "Because you still fight." That answer filled her with a strength that water could not give. She was not chosen because she was destined by birth, nor because of the cruelty of those who abandoned her. She was chosen because she had refused to yield, even when the desert demanded her life. From that night onward she walked differently. Her steps no longer faltered. She lifted her head to the stars and let the whispers of the desert spirits weave into her soul. They did not shield her from all suffering. The heat still burned, the hunger still gnawed, and her body still weakened. But they carried her heart. They reminded her that survival was not only flesh enduring, but spirit refusing to fall silent. And so, when the wind rose in the dead of night and howled across the desert, the spirits' voices rose with it. Together they spoke her name not as a lament but as a vow. The desert did not own her. The desert had become her ally. By dawn, as she stood atop a high dune and looked upon the endless horizon, she knew with unshakable certainty, she was walking not just for herself, but for the voices that had kept her alive. She carried their memory, their whispers, their strength. The desert had tested her to the limits of human endurance. Days bled into nights, nights into days, and the line between waking and dreaming blurred. She no longer walked with certainty. Her feet dragged across the sand as though they belonged to someone else. Her lips were cracked, her skin burned, and each breath came as though it had to claw its way out of her chest. Yet still she moved forward, guided by nothing more than the faint whispers in the wind and the shimmer of the stars above. And then, when she was certain her body could bear no more, she saw it. At first, it seemed a cruel mirage, another trick of the desert meant to mock her hunger and thirst. A faint shimmer on the horizon, a patch of green where no green should grow. Her heart leapt painfully, for she had seen illusions before, phantoms of water and shade that dissolved into the dust as she neared. But this time something was different. The whispers of the wind grew stronger, circling her ears as if urging her forward. Go on. Do not stop. Truth lies ahead. She stumbled, half running, half falling toward it, afraid that if she blinked it would vanish. Yet the closer she came, the more real it became. Palm trees swayed gently in a breeze she could not yet feel. The sound of trickling water teased her ears. The scent of damp earth, rich and alive, reached her nose. By the time she reached its edge, she collapsed to her knees. Before her stretched a pool of clear water, glittering under the sunlight like a mirror of the sky. The oasis was ringed with tall grasses and low shrubs, bursting with life that should have been impossible in the barren wasteland she had crossed. It felt untouched, sacred, like a hidden heart of the desert that revealed itself only to those who had proven worthy. She plunged her hands into the water, the coolness shocking her senses awake, and drank greedily. Each sip was life itself, seeping into her dry bones and filling her veins with strength. Tears spilled down her face, for she could not tell where her suffering ended and where this salvation began. When her thirst was quenched, she lay back in the shade of the palms, listening to the wind as it rustled through the leaves. But soon she noticed something strange. The water in the pool was not still. It shimmered unnaturally, rippling in patterns even when no breeze touched it. As she peered into its depths, she saw not only her reflection, but fragments of images, flashes of faces, places, and moments she did not fully understand. It was as though the oasis was not merely water, but a mirror of truth. She saw her past, the betrayal, the cruelty that had left her in the desert to die. The faces of those who had turned against her twisted with malice and fear. She flinched, for the pain of that memory still burned fresh. But the water did not stop there. It showed her something more, her own face not as it was now, worn and broken by suffering, but as it could be, radiant, unyielding, crowned with a strength born of survival. She reached out toward the vision, her fingertips brushing the water's surface, and ripples spread outward, carrying her reflection into the shimmering distance. The whispers of the desert returned, but now they were louder, clearer. They did not sound like echoes of her own thoughts, but voices older than time, resonant with wisdom. You are not forgotten. The desert is cruel, but it remembers those who endure. Drink, rest, and rise. Your journey is not yet over. She closed her eyes, letting the voices sink into her heart. She realized then that this oasis was more than a gift of survival. It was a test, a revelation. It had shown her that the desert itself, though merciless, held secrets of compassion. Secrets meant for those who refused to surrender. She spent the night by the water's edge. The stars above seemed brighter, their light pooling in the oasis until the whole place glowed faintly, as if it belonged to both earth and sky. In the stillness, she felt the presence of the desert spirits watching over her, not as phantoms of fear, but as guardians guiding her steps. By dawn she knew the truth, she had not been spared by chance. She had been chosen. When she rose from the oasis, her body felt renewed, but more importantly, her spirit was unshakable. The desert had not destroyed her. It had broken her down only to rebuild her stronger. And now, with the memory of the oasis carved into her soul, she felt as though she carried a piece of its magic within her, a wellspring of truth and resilience that could never be taken away. With her skin cooled, her thirst quenched, and her strength returned, she turned her gaze once more to the endless horizon. The wind whispered her name again, this time not as a plea for survival, but as a promise. Keep walking. The stars will lead you. The truth you carry will light the way. And so, she stepped back into the desert, no longer a broken wanderer, but a woman forged by fire, wind, and truth, ready for whatever destiny awaited her beyond the sands. The wind rose again, this time not as a gentle sigh slipping between dunes, but as a full breath, alive with urgency, alive with meaning. It swirled around her ankles, tugging at the hem of her tattered dress, lifting strands of her hair into the night air as if to remind her that she was still part of something larger. She stopped walking, frozen by the sudden surge, for the sound was no longer just the language of shifting sands or restless desert storms. It carried a cadence, a rhythm, a message. It was as if the desert itself had finally chosen to speak after days of only listening to her struggles. Her heart pounded, the exhaustion weighing on her bones momentarily lifted, as though the desert's breath had seeped into her chest to keep her upright. She tilted her face toward the stars and whispered, "Is it you?" The winds responded with a low, steady hum that seemed to say, "Yes, child, you are not forgotten." She let the words sink in, not through her ears but through her skin, her soul. They wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl of invisible threads, warming her in a way no fire ever could. Memories that had threatened to fade suddenly reignited. The sound of laughter she had once shared with her family, the firm voice of her mother reminding her that courage was a seed planted in dark soil, the strength of her father's embrace that had always reminded her she was never truly alone. The wind carried all these fragments back to her, whispering them like precious secrets meant to be remembered now, when despair had nearly consumed her. The wind was not merely air rushing across the earth. It was memory, it was spirit, it was the desert's way of telling her that she belonged to a greater story that would not abandon her. Her body, though battered from endless wandering, felt momentarily light as the wind lifted the weight pressing against her chest. Each step she took forward was no longer a stumble but a rhythm synchronized with the breath of the desert itself. It was as though her feet were guided by an unseen hand, every grain of sand shifting to ease her passage, every gust of air rising to shield her from the sharp bite of the night. She closed her eyes and listened, allowing herself to trust. The wind had turned into a companion, one that she could neither see nor hold, yet one she could rely upon more deeply than anything she had known in this forsaken place. For the first time since her exile into the vast emptiness, she felt anchored to something beyond herself. As she moved forward, she began to notice how the desert itself seemed to pulse with life under the touch of the returning wind. The dunes no longer appeared hostile, but like rolling waves leading her toward some unseen shore. The stars above shimmered brighter, as though reflecting the voice of the air, harmonizing in a celestial chorus that urged her onward. Even the silence between gusts seemed alive with expectation, filled with meaning too vast for words. She understood then that what she was experiencing was not merely survival, it was communion. The desert was speaking and she was learning to understand. The voice of the wind grew clearer, layered with tones that reminded her of ancestors she had only heard about in hushed fireside tales. There was authority in the gusts, yet tenderness too, as if generations were gathering around her, reminding her that she was a continuation of their endurance, a living echo of their strength. They had crossed hardships, faced exile, endured hunger, and still lived in the whispers of the earth, and now their voices were entwined with hers. She felt less like a wandering soul and more like the vessel of something timeless. For the first time she saw her journey not as punishment, but as initiation into a deeper truth of who she was meant to be. Her tears came suddenly, unrestrained, but unlike before, they were not born of despair. They were tears of release, of recognition, of belonging. Each drop that fell onto the sand sparkled faintly in the starlight before being absorbed, as if the desert itself was drinking her sorrow and transforming it into strength. The wind swirled around her in response, cool against her damp cheeks, lifting the heaviness from her spirit. The words she had once whispered in desperation, prayers that seemed to vanish into silence, now came back to her in the wind's song. They had not been ignored, they had been carried, cradled, and returned when the time was right. As dawn began to tint the horizon with pale hues of gold, the winds did not fade but grew steadier, as though guiding her toward a promise waiting beyond the edge of her sight. The voice of the desert reminded her that her steps were seen, her strength acknowledged, her journey woven into the endless fabric of survival and rebirth. She realized then that the wind's return was not merely comfort, it was a declaration. She was not forgotten, not abandoned, not erased by the cruelty that had cast her here. She was part of something eternal, something vast and unbreakable. Every breath she took was shared with the desert, and every step she made was carried on the wings of a wind that would never let her walk unseen again. The desert was no longer just a wasteland beneath her feet. It had become a vast, breathing entity, one that seemed to speak through every shifting dune, every grain of sand that clung to her skin. What once felt like a prison of endless heat and emptiness was now transforming before her eyes into something different, something alive. She began to see the desert not as an enemy but as a teacher, and in its silence she discovered a strange form of companionship. Her steps, though weary, were no longer hesitant. She had learned the rhythm of the sand, how to step lightly so her feet sank less, how to lean into the wind instead of fighting it, how to pause when the air grew heavy and the dunes trembled like waves. Each day seemed to test her in new ways, yet with every trial her body and spirit hardened. Hunger gnawed at her, thirst burned through her veins, but neither broke her. Instead, they became part of her training, constant reminders that survival was not given but forged. The whispers in the wind, once faint and fleeting, grew steadier. They did not speak in words she could name, but in pulses of courage, in waves of unseen comfort. Sometimes, when she stumbled and nearly fell, a gust would rise against her back as if pushing her onward. Other times, when despair hovered, she felt the sands cool beneath her feet for no reason at all, granting her brief relief. It was as if the desert itself had taken her into its care, shaping her, testing her, and preparing her for something far greater than survival. At night, when she lay beneath the vast expanse of stars, she no longer wept out of loneliness. Instead, she felt the universe pressing close, as though each star was a watchful eye, each constellation a hand stretched out to guide her. She spoke aloud, not to herself but to the desert, the stars, the winds, the unseen spirits that hovered just beyond her sight. Her voice no longer trembled with fear but carried strength, as though every word she uttered planted roots in the shifting sands. "I will not break," she whispered one night, her lips cracked but her tone steady. "You will not take me as you have taken others. I am more than this body. I am more than the hunger and thirst. I am more than mortal." The desert seemed to listen. The wind stirred gently, circling her like a cloak. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, allowing the warmth of the sand to seep into her bones. It was painful, but it was also cleansing, as though each trial burned away weakness and left her purified. As the days passed, she began to notice how her senses sharpened. The smallest shifts in the dunes revealed the direction of the wind. The faintest rustle carried warnings of distant movement. Her body grew lean, her skin darkened under the sun, and her spirit grew unyielding. What had once been fragility was now resilience. She no longer merely walked through the desert, she walked with it, part of its rhythm, part of its eternal breath. There were moments when visions danced before her eyes, shapes of women draped in flowing veils, their faces hidden, their hands raised as though blessing her path. At first she thought these were illusions born of exhaustion, but the more she saw them, the more real they felt. They were not cruel apparitions. Their presence was steady, their silence comforting. The spirits of the desert, perhaps, the keepers of these endless sands. And in their silence she found her strength echoed back to her, magnified. One evening, when the horizon bled red with sunset, she climbed a high dune and stood tall against the sweeping winds. The sands lashed against her legs, the gusts tore at her hair, but she did not flinch. She raised her arms wide and shouted into the storm. "I am not forgotten," she cried. "You will not claim me. I carry the strength of those before me, and I will endure." The desert answered not in words but in power. The winds swirled around her in a great spiral, and for the first time she did not cower. Instead, she leaned into them, allowing the gusts to whip against her body until she felt her very soul vibrating with energy. It was not destruction, it was transformation. She felt alive in a way she had never felt before, as if her veins carried not just blood but fire and wind. By the time the storm calmed, she stood unshaken, her eyes sharp, her heart unafraid. She realized then that the desert was not trying to kill her. It was reshaping her, stripping away the excess until only her core remained, strong, untouchable, eternal. Each day after, she walked with her head held higher. The desert had not changed. The sun still burned, the sand still shifted, and the wind still roared. But she had changed. She no longer felt like a fragile traveler lost in the void. She felt as if she belonged to this place, as if the desert itself had claimed her as its child. She was no longer merely surviving. She was gathering strength, piece by piece, from every whisper of wind, every flicker of star, every shifting dune. She was becoming something more than human, something forged of earth and spirit, something the desert itself had birthed. And though she did not yet know where her path would end, she understood now that she would not walk it as she once was. She was becoming, with each step, a living testament to endurance, a spirit of the desert in mortal form.